Hello and welcome to the podcast. In today's episode, I'll be talking to Sara Liyanage. She is a blogger, an author, and also somebody who was diagnosed with breast cancer in her early 40s. In today's episode, we talk about her diagnosis, how she coped with her treatment, and also the amazing things she is now doing as a result of her breast cancer diagnosis. She now runs a blog by the name of Ticking Off Breast Cancer, and also recently published a book with the same name. We both had a really good time chatting with each other, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. So, let's get started. Sara, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks, Tasha. How are you?
I'm all right, thank you very much. So we have finally connected after a few hiccups along the way, and I'm so chuffed and grateful that we have managed to get some time together to have this really interesting conversation, I'm sure. You and I connected via social media, Twitter specifically, and it was through our interactions that I got to learn a little bit more about you and your story, which you have generously agreed to share with us today. For the listeners, could you please tell me a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm now 45, and 3 years ago I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I live just outside of London. I'm married with 2 children. My daughter was 9 at the time of my diagnosis, and my son was 11. When I was diagnosed, I was working 4 days a week in London. I'm now working 2 days a week, 1 day from home, 1 day in London. And I now run a website called Ticking Off Breast Cancer, and I've just had a book published of the same name, Ticking Off Breast Cancer. Both are aimed at helping people who are going through breast cancer treatment. Also, both are aimed at helping friends and family as well. And they're based on my experience, but really just with the aim of helping people who are going through it.
Yes, you were diagnosed with breast cancer in your early 40s. You were working as a lawyer at the time. And since then, as you said, you created this blog called Ticking Off Breast Cancer and also recently published a book of the same title. And I'm sure we'll be talking about both of those in more detail later on in this conversation. But if you could go back to 2016, and I think you were away on your holidays, and you found a lump in your armpit. Is that right? Could you tell us what happened?
That's right. So we were on holiday. I was just lying on a sunbed and scratched my armpit and thought, there's something there. What's that? Felt my other armpit. There wasn't anything there. It felt like a small marble, sort of spherical in shape. And I thought it was a bit odd, but alarm bells didn't go off straight away. I have a history of breast cysts. So when I turned round about my 40th birthday, round about then, I did find a couple of lumps in my breast, and I got those checked out, and it turns out that they're cysts, which is not uncommon in women. Nothing to do with breast cancer, and it isn't a precursor for breast cancer either. So I had lumpy boobs, and the lump in my armpit, I did think it was a bit odd. And then I couldn't find anything different in my breasts or my chest area. I had a little feel around. There wasn't anything else unusual. I didn't really worry about it. We came back from holiday and I checked under there again, couldn't find the lump in my armpit. Then a little while later, I found it again. It turned out, I now realise that when I was feeling under my arm on the sunbed, my arm was above my head. And then the time I was looking, sort of having a feel around when I was back home, my arm was down by my side. And I think there was a difference in the way my arm was as to whether I could feel it or not. So I sort of momentarily lost it really for a few weeks. But then, I happened to be, I think I was in bed and I found it again. I thought, actually, that's still there. I'm not sure that this is right. I'll go and get it checked out. So I went to my GP, who had a little feel around. She felt my breast as well, and she said, "Oh, yeah, you've got lumpy breasts, but they they all feel like cysts. Can't feel anything that I'm concerned about there. But let's go get you checked out anyway, because I'm not sure what this lump in your armpit is. At that point, I still wasn't overly worried. She didn't seem to be worried either. She just wasn't really sure what it was. So referred to the breast clinic, which I was familiar with from having my cysts checked out. A mammogram and ultrasound of my breasts didn't show anything unusual. There were a number of cysts, but that was to be expected because they were already there. And you can develop new cysts, so it's not a question of having breast cysts develop and then it stays exactly the same. They change over time. So they were checked out. There was just nothing in my breast, but they weren't really happy with the lump under my arm, and they did a biopsy of it. And I went away. And it was interesting because the breast consultant, he wasn't worried at all, and he couldn't see anything in my breast on the mammogram or the ultrasound. And he said, I'm sure it's a swollen gland or something like that, but, we'll do a biopsy, check it anyway. So I went away not really too worried about it. Obviously, there was a little, very, very small worry in my head, because having a biopsy isn't a good thing. Something is a little bit out of the ordinary, but I wasn't too worried about it. So I then went back for the results, not expecting at all to be told it was cancer, because had they found a lump in my breast and then that plus the lump in my armpit had been tested, I would have been a little bit worried. Well, more than a little bit, I would have been really worried. But there was nothing showing up on the mammogram in my breast. So I went along to the appointment. They said to me when I had the biopsy, when you come back for results, it's good to come back with someone, because I was on my own. And I think their sort of general policy is if you're coming back, bring someone with you. So I didn't ask my husband to come home early from work. I wasn't worried. But my mum was here, and so she said, I'll come with you. So we went along to the appointment to get the results, and everything changed from that moment on.
So when they did the scan, presumably you got an ultrasound scan of your armpit. They didn't tell you that it looked particularly worrying at that time?
No, they didn't. Obviously, I thought the fact that they were doing a biopsy made me think it's not just a cyst. It's not the same thing that I've got in my breasts, which is what I was thinking it probably was. I'm not a medically trained person. I don't know anything about this sort of thing. So I was going into this as a complete novice, not understanding the link between lumps in the armpit and breast cancer. So at that time, I didn't know enough. I didn't know anything that I know now. And I think also part of it was also wishful thinking on my part as well. So, I didn't want to worry about it. They hadn't said to me, it's really worrying, this lump in your armpit. It was more a case of, it's a bit unusual, but we're not really sure what it is, so we'll just do a little test.
So they then gave you the diagnosis of breast cancer, and yet they haven't really found any abnormalities in your breast. So I understand that did they do more tests to find out if they had missed it on the mammogram?
Yes. So they didn't give me a diagnosis of breast cancer at that stage. They said your lymph nodes are swollen with cancer cells. So that's how I had my cancer diagnosis. It wasn't you've got breast cancer. It was we did the test on your lymph nodes and it's come back positive for cancer cells. So that obviously that was an absolute shock to me. That was not expected, and it completely floored me. I was absolutely, totally blown away with shock. Then he proceeded to explain that it was a bit of a dilemma for them because the lymph nodes had come back testing positive for cancer cells, but they couldn't find a tumour in my breasts from the mammogram or the ultrasound that they'd done at my previous appointment. And they'd revisited those in light of the test results for the armpit lump. And it was a little bit confusing. And I was really confused because I was in shock. And I was thinking, well, where have these cancer cells come from? So the consultant sent me off for a breast MRI. So I went, not that day, but went along for my breast MRI appointment, which is more sensitive to picking up changes in the breast than the mammogram.
Yes, so they'll pick up things that mammogram would not necessarily pick up. It's highly, highly sensitive.
Yeah, which I didn't realise at the time either, and I do now. So I went off my MRI, went back for the test results, and the MRI hadn't picked up anything. And so we were really, I was really confused by this, shock, still in a state of shock, and confusion was getting more and more intense by the day. So following the MRI, it was a question of, well, the cancer cells have to have come from somewhere, so we'll send you for a PET scan.
So the hunt continues.
The hunt continued. And again, I had entered a new world. I don't know anything about the medical side of things. Never had anyone in my family go through this. So, all these different scans were all new to me. I'd never heard of a PET scan. I found out that it was the most sensitive of scans, and they were going to test me from head to toe to see if there was a sign of anything anywhere in my body. And I had shadows on my pancreas and my thyroid. I got those scanned. Subsequently, I had another MRI, ultrasound. They came back just as nothing. They were just shadows. But I think because of the sensitivity of the PET, it can be things that actually turn out not to be anything. And really, that was sort of the last port of call, really, in terms of scanning me. I don't know how they do this. You'll know this better than me, Tasha, but they were able to test the cells that were in my lymph nodes in my armpit. I don't know how they do this, but somehow or other they know that the cancer cells in the lymph nodes were breast cancer cells, HER2 positive, and they were estrogen positive. So they were absolutely 100% confident that I had breast cancer, but they just weren't sure where it had come from. And so at that point, I was told, we're treating this as breast cancer. It's an unusual situation. And in fact, my breast consultant, he's retired now, and I imagine he was 70 odd when he was treating me. He was certainly incredibly experienced. And he said to me he'd only seen this situation half a dozen times in his career. So he'd come across it before, which was comforting, but really not very often. So I think for me, everyone's the same. We all being diagnosed with cancer is incredibly scary for everybody. I had this sort of added confusion element to mine. So for a couple of weeks, I was in limbo of, I've got cancer, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. Once I got that sort of final diagnosis of, right, we're treating it as breast cancer, and now we're going to talk about the treatment plan, it was actually a point where I could then accept what was happening. Yes, it was scary. I was in shock and I was petrified, but knowing that then we could put a treatment plan into place was quite comforting in a peculiar way.
You got the diagnosis of cancer from an unusual route, in that usually women and men would present with a lump in the breast, and then that is diagnosed as a cancer, i.e. breast cancer, and then we check in the armpit. In your case, it's quite an unusual presentation. And I guess for you, not only did you have to contend with the diagnosis to begin with, but also that uncertainty of, where is this coming from? And that must have been extremely hard for you to deal with.
It was. I can't compare myself to everyone else. We're all very individual with the way that cancer is diagnosed and the tests we have to go through. But from my perspective, there was a few weeks between being told I had cancer and actually then going through all these tests where I felt like I was in limbo. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I lost a load of weight and I couldn't think about anything other than what was going on. And it was so difficult to come to terms with the diagnosis because I didn't know what I was coming to terms with. So I think for me, that was the hardest point. It was at that point that I could, I suppose, gain a little bit of control. And I think that the point for me with the way that my breast cancer was diagnosed, I know it was an incredibly unusual presentation of breast cancer, but it really reiterated to me the need for men and women to check their armpits for lumps, not just checking the breasts. And actually, it's the whole of the chest area, isn't it? So, and under the arms. And what I've noticed is in a lot of the literature talking about how to check your breasts, the armpit point is either sort of just mentioned as a side at the end, or it's not mentioned at all. So, part of my story is to encourage everyone to check their armpits.
That's very, very true, actually. And I think it's something that we probably don't explore in more detail. We encourage, obviously, everybody to examine their breasts, but we do sometimes forget that the armpit is also part of that examination. And it's very, very important to do that as well, as you rightly said. So then you finally got the diagnosis that you had breast cancer, albeit in a slightly unusual presentation. And then you had surgery. What was the surgery like?
So I obviously didn't have any breast surgeries because there was nothing in my breast. There was talk subsequently down the line of a mastectomy, because the fact that they couldn't find anything, would it actually be safer to have a mastectomy? But the general consensus amongst my breast consultant and his colleagues, because this is an unusual situation, he was taking this to his colleagues quite regularly, almost a step of the way actually. And the general consensus was actually no, not to have a mastectomy, but that radiotherapy would be fine, would do the job. And so the surgery I had was a full axillary node clearance. So all the lymph nodes in my left armpit were removed. And that was going into hospital. I had surgery. I was in hospital overnight, I think for 2 nights after that. Had the drain put into my armpit. And as everyone knows who's had that type of surgery in their armpit, you can't then lift your arm up and use your arm for quite a while afterwards, and have to undergo physiotherapy and do regular exercises to get it working again. It was tough. It wasn't pleasant. It was, the recovery afterwards, the time it took for my arm to get moving again, and then sleeping and everything, doing day-to-day things in the kitchen, was difficult with one arm out of action. But I do count myself lucky that, compared to other women who are having far more serious surgery, for me, it wasn't too bad. I say it was only lymph nodes removed, but at the same time, any surgery is unpleasant. So
Sure, any surgery is still surgery, isn't it?
yes, exactly. So so I had the surgery fairly soon after they had come to the conclusion that it was breast cancer, and we now need to move on as if we're treating breast cancer. So I had the surgery very soon. I was diagnosed in October, and then I had all these tests going out through the rest of October. I had my surgery fairly early on in November, and I was really keen to get surgery over and done with, because the plan was for me to have surgery, then chemotherapy. And Christmas was on the horizon. Was so desperate to get chemotherapy started before Christmas, because I couldn't bear the thought of having to wait a couple of weeks longer because of the Christmas New Year break. And I think as everyone who is in this situation will probably agree, that once you've been told you have cancer, you are just so desperate to get that cancer out of you and go through the treatment as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, just to get it all out and mop up any stray cells that might be swimming around. So I had the surgery, as I say, at the beginning of November, and then I think I probably had maybe a recovery period of a month, and started my first chemotherapy session was mid-December. So it was approximately 10 days before Christmas Day, actually.
Wow. So it's never a good time to have any form of treatment. But I guess, having it around Christmas time must have been very, very difficult and tricky for you.
It was difficult because of the children, because you want to keep life as normal as possible for children. And we told them what was happening to me. We were very open and honest with them from the start, obviously within certain limitations, because they were 9 and 11, and we didn't want to overly worry them or equally give them too little information, and we didn't want to give them a false sense of hope. We just wanted to be as honest as we could be, but within the context of their ages. And part of me having cancer, we were so keen to keep life as normal as possible, which obviously included Christmas. So I wanted to have my first chemotherapy session over in time that I would then have recovered from the worst of the side effects by the time it was Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So it's interesting because between surgery and my first chemo, I got so organised for Christmas. We were literally ready for Christmas when I went in for chemo, because I didn't know what to expect from chemotherapy. I only know what everyone else knows from the telly and films, which actually I now know is very unrealistic. All I could imagine was I'm just going to be dog sick and feeling awful and not able to do anything as soon as I've had chemotherapy. And so I need to get all my presents bought, all the presents wrapped, everything ready for Christmas Day. And we were completely ready for Christmas Day by the time I had my first chemotherapy session.
Sounds like you're super organized.
Yeah, I am a very organized person, actually. Yes.
So, I mean, chemotherapy is the treatment that people really fear the most, because you don't really know how you can cope or you fare with chemotherapy unless you've had it. And the only frame of reference would be what you see on the television or films. And different people react to chemotherapy differently. I know people who have their ups and downs, and I think that is probably the more usual course. But some people are really affected by chemotherapy and others aren't so much. So how did you cope with chemotherapy yourself?
For me, I didn't cope very well. It wasn't good for me. So I had 6 cycles of EC. So they were on a 3-weekly basis. So I had the infusion day 1, and then 21 days later, next infusion. I had 6 of those of EC. And then I moved on to Taxol, where it was weekly. So I was going in every week. And when you're told you're going to have chemotherapy, actually, when you're diagnosed with cancer and people start talking about cancer, they start talking about oncologists, they start talking about chemotherapy, it's all completely alien. I felt that I had just been dropped into a new reality. I had been taken out of my normality and dropped into a new reality where all these strange words were being said and strange things were happening. And chemotherapy is the strangest of all, because just the word sort of instills this fear in you, because you associate chemotherapy with being sick, going bald, and dying, because that's how the media portrays it in books and films and television programs. I was absolutely petrified about starting chemotherapy. I didn't know what to expect. And like you say, everyone reacts differently. So different chemotherapy drugs have different effect on different people. Everyone has different drugs, and then they suffer different side effects. And so I didn't really have a point of reference, as you put it, to go on for this. So it was really a question of, until I start this thing, I'm not going to know how to deal with it. That's a really strange sensation, because you want to start, because you know that a big part of your fear is fear of the unknown. And you want to start because you want to start getting the treatment so that you can start to get better and you can recover. But at the same time, it's the last thing in the world that you want to do. you do not want to go into hospital, have something hooked up to your veins in whatever way, whether it's a port, a PICC line, or a cannula, whatever it is, and you don't want to have these horrible drugs pumped into you because you don't know how it's going to feel when they're going in, and you don't know how it's going to feel afterwards and what it's going to do to you. So it's a very strange period of time waiting for chemotherapy because half of you is raring to go and the other half is running a mile. It's the last thing you want to do. And so for me, I had my first chemo infusion, and I think everything just changed after that because it really, really affected me. I had all the side effects. I felt terribly nauseous, really sick, just not good at all. The first cycle I had, the side effects, they gradually wore off after, I would say, probably about 4 days. And so after that, I felt better. I felt really, really tired. But then by the time Christmas came, I was feeling back to normal. I actually felt really good. And I still had a full head of hair. I had energy. I actually felt normal after that. So it was having the first chemo just before Christmas worked for me. But then the thing about chemotherapy is, is that it's cumulative. So whilst I felt quite good after I think it was around about day 4 of my first cycle, my second cycle, the side effects were a bit more intense and lasted a bit longer. And that just built up and up and up as I went through all my chemotherapy infusions to the point where it floored me. I took an extended leave of absence from work because I realised I wasn't going to be able to do any worthwhile work whilst I was going through chemotherapy. And really just focus, for me, the focus was on waking up every day, working out how I felt, what I was going to be able to do that day, trying to do it, and then usually failing, resting a lot, and going to bed at the end of the day feeling rubbish and then not sleeping. So it wasn't pleasant. It was really not a very nice experience for me.
You had, I think you had really close friends, and your parents, specifically your mum, helps you quite a bit. Is that right?
That's right. So I'm incredibly lucky. I still have both parents. They live very close to us. My mum is the sort of person who won't take no for an answer, and she'll just help you even if you don't ask for it. And she told us that she was going to come and stay with us every chemo cycle. She'd come the day that I went in for chemo and stay as long as we needed. It was an absolute godsend because we couldn't have coped without her. It did mean that my husband, who had literally 3 weeks before I was diagnosed, started a new job. It meant that he was able to go into work as much as possible and really focus on that new job. And mum was there. She was helping out with the kids. And as well as my parents, we had a fabulous support network of friends locally. As I said, my kids were at primary school. And the thing about having children of primary school age is that you have almost a natural network there, a natural support network, because I had my friends who were parents of children at the school, but even people who weren't friends of mine, but their kids were at school with mine, they were all there helping out. Everyone was helping out. We had so many meals cooked for us and brought around for the freezer. I had people giving my children lifts to and from school. People were having them at weekends or in the evenings. The childcare was just sorted. It was brilliant. And it was really lovely for the children as well, because they didn't want to be stuck at home looking at their mum, who by this point was completely bald and swollen and red-faced and puffy and lying around feeling terrible. So getting them out of the house to see friends and keeping them busy was brilliant. And we had more offers than we could take up. And I had people offering and taking me to hospital for my medical appointments and my treatments. Yeah, it was just a real eye-opener for seeing the good in people and seeing the best of human nature. We were absolutely spoiled, and incredibly grateful for that.
Well, that sounds amazing. It is incredible. You find out who your friends are in times of difficulty.
You absolutely do, Tasha, absolutely. And I think I was 42 when I was diagnosed, and I think that's fairly young for a cancer diagnosis. And certainly within my peer group here, I was one of the first, and I was definitely the first person for a lot of my friends that they knew to go through chemotherapy. And that's kind of like the hardest part of cancer treatment. That's where you need the most support. And so for a lot of my friends and my peer group and people who I didn't know very well but stepped up and helped out, I think it was very much for them a situation which was, oh my goodness, this has happened to Sarah, but it could have happened to any one of us. And it was a bit of an eye-opener for everybody. And I think that is part of the reason why everyone was suddenly rallying around, because you realise none of us are infallible, none of us are immune to this sort of thing. So that, I think, is an incentive, isn't it, to go out and help people. So I really think that, seeing it for the first time in your peer group is really scary. And you just want to do anything you can for the person who's going through it. And so we were really very lucky to be on the receiving end of so much kindness and practical support.
Well, that's so lovely to hear. So then you managed to get through chemotherapy, and I think you probably celebrated when you received your last cycle.
Yes.
And then you had radiotherapy, is that right?
That's right. Yes, I went on to radiotherapy.
And how was radiotherapy compared to chemotherapy?
Radiotherapy has its challenges. It wasn't as challenging as chemotherapy. That's not to say that that's the same for everyone, because I think some people do find radiotherapy to be as challenging, perhaps more so. But for me, the main struggle I had with radiotherapy was the tiredness. So I was going in to hospital every day. It was about a 30-minute drive away. I didn't have to drive myself once because I had so many people offering me lifts, and I took them up on that because it was a really nice opportunity to get to see my friends. I'd gone from working 4 days a week and having 1 day a week where I was running around doing all sorts of chores, and I never saw anyone during the week, to being at home through cancer treatment and able to see all my friends all the time.
So your social life markedly improved.
It did. It was lovely. And so, yes, when people were offering to drive me to and from radiotherapy, I was, yes, please, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so the excuse for a chinwag and have a chat.
It was fabulous. I had some great car journeys. It was really nice. And so you're going in every day. You're literally in the treatment room for 10 minutes. I took my top off, I lie down. They'd get me into position, which would probably take maybe 5 minutes, and then have the radiotherapy zapping. And then I was out of there. So the process itself wasn't very long. The journey was not hard, but the culmination of going in every day and having this radiation is incredibly tiring, very, very tiring. And also I was still recovering from chemotherapy. I was so tired anyway that this was just increasing my fatigue levels, really. And I was very lucky. I didn't experience too many skin issues. I had a little bit of blistering, but I count myself lucky that I didn't have much at all, because I do know that for some people it is horrifically painful. For me, radiotherapy was very manageable, actually.
And did you have 3 weeks worth, so 5 days a week for 3 weeks?
Yeah. Monday to Friday for 3 weeks, yes.
Right. So then after that, presumably you said your cancer was HER2 positive, so you had Herceptin as well?
So I had my first Herceptin injection when I changed from EC to Taxol chemo. So they started me on Herceptin at the same time as Taxol. So I was having them at the same time. Herceptin was every 3 weeks, Taxol was every week. And the Herceptin injections were for a year.
Right. So then you completed your radiotherapy and then you continued with your Herceptin for the full year. And then this culmination of your diagnosis and your treatment compelled you to create a blog.
Yes, it did. So I could talk for hours about why I started the website, and I know we don't have hours. And also, I think it would be incredibly boring for most. The thing about the website was, I'll tell you the story of how it came about. I'll try and be quick. So I think I was coming to the end of chemotherapy. I don't think I'd finished, but I was feeling a bit better because Taxol didn't really affect me quite as badly as the EC had done. So I was coming towards the end of it, and my good friend Libby, who had been by my side from the start, she's a great friend. She's helping me out loads. She came to me and she said, "Oh, another one of my friends locally just been diagnosed with breast cancer. Same age as us, kids the same age. You know, obviously she's in shock. Would you have a chat to her?" And I obviously agreed because I, at the time when I had been diagnosed, didn't know anyone or have anyone who knew anyone. And I would have loved that, just to have a little chat with someone who could give me a little bit of a heads up. So I said, yes, I'd absolutely be delighted to chat to her. And so I was thinking about what to tell her. She hadn't had any treatment. She'd only been diagnosed, and she had HER2 positive, estrogen positive breast cancer, same as me. And she hadn't undergone any treatment. I think she just wanted to come and chat to someone who had been there and done that. And I was thinking about what to talk to her about and what not to talk to her about and what I would have wanted. And I started writing some notes, and then they got longer and longer and longer. And I had so much to talk to her about. I didn't want to worry her, but I just wanted to give her a little bit of practical advice. I was going to focus on practical advice, not give her anything to worry about, but just sort of be there for her and say to her, you know, I won't lie to you. It's tough, but, you know, I'm going to be here for you. And if you've got any questions as you go through, you can talk to me about it. And she came around, we had a lovely chat, and she found it all incredibly helpful. And actually, we were in touch throughout the entirety of her treatment in the end. And at that point, I thought, gosh, could I do this for other people? How can I do this for other people? How can I use my experience to help someone else who's about to embark on it or who's going through treatment themselves? Coupled with the fact that the internet is a scary place for people. I thought, why don't I put together a very straightforward, simple little website focusing on practical advice for people who are going through breast cancer. They're really scared and they just want somewhere to turn to where they're going to get simple, straightforward, practical advice and not be scared out of their minds. You know, no medical advice, not even talking about statistics, because when someone's diagnosed with breast cancer, there's a spectrum of information that they're going to look for. You've got one end of the spectrum is the person who will go out and find out absolutely every single tiny detail that they can find about their diagnosis. They will read research papers, books, go on all sorts of internet searches and talk to people and go online and meet people at support groups and go wherever they can find information to help them get through their diagnosis and their treatment. So that's at one end of the spectrum. And at the other end of the spectrum are the people who are so petrified and in so much shock that they can't bring themselves to do anything. And they almost bury their head in the sand and just literally go with what their medical team is telling them. There is no right or wrong way of doing it. It's all very individual and it's all very much down to the person at the time and what's right for them. And I think most people fit somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. And I think that's where I was. I was very much in the middle. So I think even for the people in the middle, there is a place for a very straightforward, simple website where you can go and find your practical information. Because there are some really wonderful websites. Don't get me wrong, there are some fabulous websites, but they're very, very big and they can be really overwhelming when you're in this fragile state of shock and confusion. And also, there's Dr. Google, isn't there? And
There is Dr. Google, our best friend.
do not go on Google. Don't Google this, don't Google that. And they're absolutely right. So I wanted to have a hand-holding website where people would feel that they've got someone there holding their hand and saying, it's tough, but you've got it. And to help you go through it, here's a checklist of things you need to take to chemo. Here's a checklist of things you need to take to hospital for surgery, that sort of thing. I didn't actually explain it very quickly at all. I did what
Your website is really, really helpful. It's an amazing website, ticking off breast cancer. You know, it's simple yet very helpful. Following from creating this amazing website, you have turned your talents to writing a book.
Yeah, that came out a month ago.
And it's called Ticking Off Breast Cancer.
It is, yes.
And it essentially describes your story from the time of your diagnosis to post-treatment. What compelled you to write the book?
I wouldn't class myself as an author or a writer. And certainly before I had cancer, I had no interest in writing. I wasn't one of those people with a book burning inside me, ready to be written. When I started writing the content for the website, I found myself enjoying it. I was finding it quite therapeutic to write out some checklists of all the things that I'd learned during my treatment, from my research and from talking to my chemo nurses, and I was writing it all out. And then I thought, actually, I need to write about what's happened to me at the same time. So I started writing about what happened to me. So I started the day I was diagnosed, and it just sort of flowed on from there. And the website, the content of the website isn't really about me or my personal experience. And so that's why I needed then to write about my personal experience, because it was a therapy for me. I was getting everything that had been going on, the shock, the mental struggles, the emotional impact that is going round and round in your head and making no sense and just making you feel terrible and anxious and scared and out of control and overwhelmed. And what I found by writing it all down, I was dealing with all of that. I was controlling it. I was processing it. And it was incredibly cathartic to write it all down. And so that's really how I started, and how I continued to write about what was happening to me. And I was really enjoying the process of the writing. So finding the right words to explain how I felt, putting something that was a bit of a mess in my head down into some sort of structured sentences and paragraphs and chapters. And it all just helped me to make sense of what I'd been through. Then I ended up with this personal account of what I had been through, which was separate to what I'd put on the website. So the website was up and running by this point. And I had this personal account and I didn't really know what to do with it. And I was thinking, wow, could this help people? Would people want to read about me? How could I use this to help people? And I'd come to realize that reading about other people's experiences when you're going through a traumatic life experience can be incredibly comforting and supportive. And I know that there is a value in reading about other people's experiences, even though everyone is individual. We have our own experiences, we have different diagnoses, different treatments. There still is some comfort in reading about other people and how they deal with things, what they're going through. And so I thought I would put this into a book and actually marry it with the website by incorporating checklists from the website into the book as well. So the book, whilst it's a chronological account, it deals with the different stages as we've discussed them today. And so there were natural places to put a checklist about chemotherapy, a checklist about surgery, a checklist about eating. And when I was putting the checklists into the book and sort of putting the book together, I got a couple of friends to read it and my sister to read it, because I obviously I was thinking, oh, I don't really know if it's good enough, or I don't really know if people are going to like it or whether it'll be helpful. So I wanted to get a little bit of feedback. And one of my friends, Gina, who was also there by my side the whole time, her sister had had breast cancer a number of years ago. And she and my sister both said, this is an amazing book. This would be an amazing book for people whose friends and family are going through breast cancer, because they felt that had they had the book or something like this when you know, as a sister of someone go through breast cancer, it would have really helped them know a bit more about what their sister was going through, how they could help, what sort of things they could do. And so that then triggered in me the thought that actually this would be really helpful for friends and family of cancer patients. So I put some checklists in for them as well. So it's not just aimed at people going through breast cancer or people who've been through it. It's very, very much aimed at the friends and family of people who are going through it. And that is a really important aspect to the book.
I've got the book in front of me. I've read it, and I have to say it's beautifully written. It's an honest account of what you've been through. It's sympathetic, it's insightful. And for those who haven't read it, I definitely recommend to pick it up. Do you think writing this book has helped you come to terms with your diagnosis?
Absolutely, 100%. There's no doubt in my mind that if I hadn't had written it, I wouldn't be where I am now mentally and emotionally. I've definitely come to terms with what's happened to me, definitely accepted what happened to me. I'm in a much better place now going forward in terms of dealing with the fear of it recurring or spreading. So I've educated myself on what I need to be looking out for in terms of secondary breast cancer. And that isn't a nice thing to have to think about, but it's an essential thing to think about. So it's essential to be aware of that, having had primary breast cancer. So I think to get to that point, I had to deal with what I've been through, and writing it all out has done that for me. It's really allowed me to move on, actually, to put the cancer behind me and move on. And I know that might sound a bit strange because I've published a book, written a book, published a book, and now I'm talking about it. But I'm talking about it because the book happens to have come out recently. But I have certainly moved on from my own experience of breast cancer. And although I'm talking to you about it now in the context of the book, and I've had the book come out, my focus is now very much the website and helping other people who are going through it. And part of that is the platform on my website for publishing guest blogs from other people who are going through breast cancer or who have been through breast cancer. Every week I publish a guest blog. Sometimes I have focus weeks where I publish a few in relation to the same subject. But I'm such an advocate for writing about a traumatic life experience as a way of therapy that, as you know from following me on Twitter, I am always banging on about, have you tried writing about it? Anyone want to write something on this topic for me? Anyone want to write something on that topic for me? Because it has been so therapeutic for me. I want other people to try it and to see if it helps them. I wasn't a writer before I did this. I'm not a writer. I don't have any creative writing experience or anything like that. I just wrote what was in my head and it all just came out. It's a bit of a mind dump. Then I sorted it out into some sort of order, which was also ordering it in my head. And I cannot explain quite how good it was for me. And so that's why I am always saying on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, if anyone wants to write anything for the website, please do. And would anyone like to write on this topic and that topic? Because it was so helpful to me. And that's really where my main focus is now. It's very much the website and encouraging other people to write for the website now.
If anybody listening out there would like to connect with you, where can they connect with you?
So the website is a good place to start. That's www.tickingoffbreastcancer.com. And then, as I have alluded to in our conversation, I'm very prolific on social media. On Twitter, I'm just looking because I'm not sure what my Twitter handle is. I think it's at @tickoffcancer on Twitter. And then on Instagram, I think they allowed me the full ticking off breast cancer on Instagram. And Facebook is ticking off breast cancer. So it's ticking off breast cancer everywhere other than Twitter, which is tick off cancer. And yes, I've got the book as well, which is also called Ticking Off Breast Cancer.
Sara, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. I am so grateful for your time, and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, really raising awareness and helping so many people out there who are going through a very difficult time in their lives, and you're there to support them all the way.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Tasha.
Thank you, Sara. Bye.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. Thank you so much once again to Sara Liyanage. You can follow her on Twitter at @tickoffcancer, and for Facebook and Instagram, she is at Ticking Off Breast Cancer. And also her book is entitled Ticking Off Breast Cancer. I will leave all the links in the show notes at www.mybreastmyhealth.com/episode 5. Thank you for listening. And if you know somebody who might benefit from listening to this particular episode, then may I ask you to consider sharing it with them, because you never know, they may greatly benefit from it. I hope to see you in the next episode.